Hi, my name is Eugene Chausovsky. I'm a Eurasia analyst here at Stratfor, and joining me today is Tack, one of Stratfor's military analysts, and we'll be discussing the latest political and tactical events in Ukraine. So, it's been about a couple of weeks now since the ceasefire was announced in eastern Ukraine between the pro-Russian rebels and the Ukrainian military forces. What is the situation like on the ground at this moment?
One of the major things we've seen during the ceasefire is the actual continuation of low-level skirmishes, artillery fire going from both sides. One of the major things to note about that is that they have not actually broken the ceasefire. On a political level, the ceasefire still holds. We haven't seen major military moves. But both sides are keeping the pressure on each other while they are reorganizing and redeploying their forces in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, and is there an area where the fighting has been concentrated, the fighting that has continued since the ceasefire?
Yes, we've seen a concentration of this activity around Donetsk, where a lot of fighting has been going on around Donetsk airport. Allegedly, there have been several attempts by the Russian and separatist forces to overrun the airport, but at this point, Ukrainian forces still hold it. At the same time, we've also seen similar activity around Luhansk, although at a lower level, where rebels have succeeded to kind of establish their territorial control around Luhansk, while Ukrainian forces have pretty much drawn out of the area.
Okay. So while these skirmishes have been continuing, we've also now started to get some rumors and some reports of a Russian military buildup in Crimea, which was actually kind of where that first security buildup on the Russian part started, and even some suggestions of forming a kind of a land bridge from Crimea into these eastern provinces to sort of link up Russian forces. What's your view of the situation in that extent?
So what we've seen in Crimea is the buildup of forces, as you say, as well as deployment of forces within Crimea closer to the border between Ukraine and Crimea. But one of the important things to note there is when we're talking about an invasion of Ukrainian territory from Crimea, the amount of forces, which accounts for several brigades, is not to a level where it could conduct very deep and extensive operations inside Ukraine. And on top of that, establishing kind of a land connection from Crimea all the way to eastern Ukraine means that you'd have to be controlling and securing a very thin and long strip of territory that would be difficult to control. Then again, on top of that, a Russian escalation to this type of military action within Ukraine once again invites more reactions from the West, from NATO and US.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the difficulties there are not just on the tactical military side of things, but first of all, as you mentioned, you're basically having to link up and going through some regions that haven't been part actually of the fighting. I mean, you're talking about oblasts like Kherson Oblast and then Zaporizhia Oblast, which don't have that same level of pro-Russian support or the separatist forces there. So that's basically an entirely new theater if Russia would choose to go that way. And then also from the higher level, as you mentioned, this is essentially Russia doing something that it hasn't done up until this point, which is a formal military invasion, essentially, of Ukraine that would be acknowledged and that would be most likely responded to by the Western powers. And what do you think that response could look like if it were to happen?
We're still seeing a very, very high degree of reluctance from the West to actually become engaged in this conflict up to a point where they would be delivering weapons to Ukraine. Even though Ukraine claims they are receiving shipments from some NATO countries, they won't disclose who or what kind of equipment they are getting. The scale of this is probably very limited. So in the end, the biggest type of response from the West would be on economical and political levels, which is where Russia might be a little more careful, because on the military side, they do hold a lot of the cards, and they have a really big capability there, also operating close to Russia, while the other countries would be operating much further away from their own bases.
Right, so that essentially would be kind of the more confrontational scenario of, basically escalating the situation. But we've also seen some hints of the opposite, actually, in terms of the political dialogue, the diplomatic negotiations that are continuing despite the skirmishes in eastern Ukraine. What we've seen on the Ukrainian side is they have actually delayed the implementation of an agreement, the free trade agreement with the Europeans. That can be seen as sort of a nod to Russia. That was delayed by a year. Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, also gave some pretty big self-rule or quote-unquote special status powers to the eastern regions, those that are not in control of the government, basically allowing them to have their own local elections, basically providing for their own security even for over the next 3 years. I mean, we'll see how that actually plays out. But I think right now it's not clear that it's going to go to this sort of escalatory confrontational status. But we're basically right now in this negotiation period where it could go either way at this point. But I think we'll have to see how the events go on the battlefield, and that's a big driver of the political ties as well, correct?
That's correct. But then again, one major thing to note is that as long as the diplomatic process is continuing, we don't really expect the situation on the battlefield to change in a notable way.
Okay. Well, we'll have to leave it there, Sim. Thanks very much for joining me, and thank you for watching.